here tonight that into this segment of Isaiah chapter 36. We're going to be talking about the Assyrian assault part 1, and then next week will be Assyrian assault part 2. All right, and so I looked at it and I thought, man, it's going to be just a little bit too much to try to cram two of those chapters into just one evening. So that's why we're doing what we're doing here tonight. Then let's go ahead and we can begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments, commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Okay, so like I said, we're doing chapter 36 tonight. For anybody that's watching in here, my name is Steve Sheik. I am the congregation leader and rabbi at Tree of Life Messianic Congregation in Houston. Actually, we're in Katy, Texas. We meet in Katy, Texas. So let's go ahead. So we finally jumped in here to what we call this historical interlude. All right, this area right here. And we're going to be talking about the wars that are going to be ensuing around Judah, the nation of Judah at this point. So tonight, this particular one is, of course, tied into, where is it? 701, right here. This is we're right at this part right here, and of course we haven't really moved from that before, but this is where we are, and then we'll probably keep moving the timeline to the right in subsequent chapters. So these chapters here, 36 through 39, they will actually conclude the section of the book that deals with the issue of trust by giving actual historical proof that Adonai will protect those who rely on him. And so in these chapters, King Hezekiah, he represents the people of Judah, of course, and these lessons that Jeremiah is giving here, or Isaiah is giving here. I was just studying Jeremiah, so that's what's still on my mind. These lessons that Isaiah is talking about here is they're meant to encourage God's people to trust in God rather than trust the arm of flesh. And so we'll see that chapters 40 through 66, they're gonna contain oracles where it's mostly talking about like the Babylonian captivity, because at this point, by the time we finish this little section here, the Assyrian threat will be pretty well negated. And then the history will start pointing toward Babylon. And so let's, this part that we're going to be studying tonight is, it's actually 2 parts. What? Go ahead. I've got, all right, let me see. Yeah, let me make sure everybody's muted, unless you have something to say, and then unmute yourself. Okay. So we're going to be looking at 36 tonight, 37 next week, and then we'll be looking at the 38 and 39, which is where Hezekiah fails. He fails to trust God, and then there's a subsequent judgment by God. And then we have the Babylonian envoys that visited Jerusalem, but they're basically spying the land and figuring out what Jerusalem has. And so anyway, that's what we'll be looking at in the next couple of weeks. And let's go ahead and in if you remember back in chapter 7 and 8, Isaiah tried to persuade King Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, to trust in God in the face of this. You remember that Syria and Ephraim were going to try to attack Jerusalem. And so Ahaz did not want to trust, he wasn't going to trust God, so he tried to get Assyria, the very people that are now attacking him, to come to help, and of course that did not end well. And so now we're up to the point where Assyria is just right on the doorsteps of Jerusalem, and we'll see what happens here. So are there any comments or questions from the history part of this that anyone might have before we go on? Maybe you'll have some questions as we get more into the lesson. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the first verse. Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. All right, so that says a lot right there. The 14th year of Hezekiah, that translates to 701 BCE. Now there's some controversy in that as to, well, how could it be the 701, and then they're talking about Hezekiah and his sickness, and they're trying to figure out what each one of those things meant. But for most of the commentaries that I've read, they agree that this time frame here is 701, because that's fairly conclusive with other historical records. That's when Sennacherib was on the rampage, and when he claimed to have taken 46 cities of Judah during this campaign. You can read about that in 2 Chronicles 32. And so the record of all of this is on what they call the prism, PRISM, of Sennacherib. And it's also called the Taylor prism because that was the archaeologist that found it. But it's in the British Museum now. And so a quote from that said that he went from the north to along the coast, defeating among others the town of Aphek, Timnah, Ekron, Lachish. Lachish was then his staging area for attacking a number of other towns. Okay, so it's a pretty good description or summary on this prism of Sennacherib that talks about this. And what we find is that the Assyrians had come down, and they were swarming all over Judah like a horde of, like locusts or something like that. Or as one commentator I was reading said, they swarmed over Judah like a horde of Tolkienian orcs. If you've read or seen the Lord of the Rings series of movies, the orcs are great big ugly creatures, and so they've just devoured everything in Judah and except for Jerusalem, and that's where they're at. So I wanted to show you a couple of pictures of, three pictures of what Lachish, this is where the army of Sennacherib had settled into. They had conquered everything, and they used the area of Lachish as a staging ground. Okay, and one of the reasons that they did that was because here you can see it's built up. It's fairly well. It would have been easily defended. The land around Lachish was flat, and it was open, so that if the Egyptian army regrouped and tried to come back against them, well, they could see that coming, and which is, basically what the Egyptians did try to do. But they would have been able to defend themselves much more easy than had they been surrounding Jerusalem with all of their forces, and then an enemy coming up behind them. That would have left them in a less defensible situation. But here's the ruins, some of the ruins of Lachish, and then here's an artist's depiction of what Lachish could have looked like, and to me it looks like just like about any of the Iron Age, this would have been late Bronze Age cities that were scattered out throughout Canaan. And you'll see that if you look at Hatzor looks very, very similar to this, and there were other cities that's just the way they built. They found them on a little hill and leveled it out so they wouldn't have to go uphill everywhere, and then they built the walls around it, making it easier to defend. And here's the prism of Sennacherib, if you had never seen that. I believe I've shown that in previous classes of whatever, when we were talking about I think maybe in earlier in Isaiah, and also in Ezekiel, where some of the goings on and the history that we are studying now was actually written down on these columns of this prism. All right, so and then here is a map that depicts the routes that Sennacherib took when he was coming down into Judah. And of course they had already taken Samaria. That was in 722 when Samaria fell. So here we are about 21 years later, and they had come down from the north, and following well-established roads and waterways, and basically food, because they could come through. These are not desert areas; these are productive areas. And they came down here, and they conquered. Well, then they get word that Egypt was on their way up, and of course Egypt is coming up through Philistia, and again, where they would have easier supply chain and all of that. And so they meet at Eltekeh, and Egypt was soundly defeated. I mean, they barely escaped with their lives. Well, a lot of them didn't, and so they were just defeated soundly, and sent back to Egypt. And they never were really another threat to Sennacherib or any of the Assyrian forces. But then they went, and here is Libnah. That was one of the other places that they attacked and defeated. Of course, everything here, this whole area, everything around Jerusalem, all the major cities were captured by the Assyrians. And here's Lachish. This is what I just showed to you, the pictures. And then from Lachish, then they went up here and eventually did surround Jerusalem once they secured the rest of the city, or the country and the countryside around Jerusalem. That's when they then settled in on going up to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's the last. I think that's the last of the pictures there, boys and girls. Okay, then let's go to verse 2. The king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem to King Hezekiah with a massive army. Rabshakeh stood by the aqueduct of the upper pool in the highway of the washer's field. Now, Rabshakeh is it's probably a title that it seems kind of like the equivalent of like a field commander, field marshal, or the person that's in charge of all the military operations that are in that theater. And the word literally means chief cupbearer, but that's a name that comes from like the original office, and it had developed over time, evolved, so that the chief cupbearer was the king's personal advisor, his chief of staff, as it were. And Lachish is about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. You saw on the map, and there is a bas-relief carving that is in the British Museum that shows Sennacherib besieging Lachish. And interestingly, the place where the Assyrian commander took his stand near Jerusalem was the same place where Isaiah had stood when he urged Ahaz, the former king of Judah, to trust God 23 years earlier. Okay, same spot. And so just kind of interesting there. So anyway, this guy was sent to basically intimidate the people of Judah, and he went to a place that, okay, I tried for several hours to nail down where this aqueduct of the upper pool in the highway of the washer's field is, and could get no consensus at all, other than the fact that it did involve getting around a waterway or a source of water. And this in its own way was a subtle attempt to kind of get to the people of Judah and said, here we are, we know where your water is, we're going to take over your water, and so that you will not be able to survive. And that was again, it's psyops, we used to call it, psychological warfare. And that's exactly what he was intimating there, that he was going to do, is take over the water supply. And so in 2 Kings 18, they talk about 3 military officials sent that were representing Sennacherib, but Isaiah only referred to the one who was the speaker among them. And it may be because that the guy he may have been in that particular place of authority, or he may be the one that had the better command of the language. So we just don't know. All right, so and okay, yeah, here's the carving or sculptor or whatever. How do you ever call that? The bas relief, bas relief of Sennacherib capturing Lachish, and how these guys having to bend over, bend down and do obeisance to the Assyrian ruler here. And so there you go. All right, so then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace. Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, came out to him. Now, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah were all important officials in Hezekiah's government, and some of the commentators believe that Hezekiah's prophecy back in chapter 22 and 23 had been fulfilled at this time then, where Eliakim was now the prime minister or the chief officer, and Shebna had been he was kind of demoted, and he's now a secretary, which was a lower position. So this may be true that prophecy had taken place by this time, or the elevation of Eliakim and the demotion of Shebna may have come later. It's something that the Bible scholars argue over, but don't get too wound up over it, because it's not a salvation issue. Okay. All right. So verse 4 here. So the Rabshakeh said to them, say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence you've relied on? So this arrogant fellow gets up there, and he didn't speak to the diplomats that like the prime minister of Judah and his the scribe and the secretary. He didn't speak to them directly, like diplomatic sources, or how that a lot of times before heads of state get together, they get together with the secondaries, and they iron out a plan, they iron out a treaty or whatever. And so when the big dogs get together, all they have to do is just sign the papers, because all the details have been worked out. Well, then in this case, Rabshakeh said he just went right over their heads, literally and figuratively, and he's shouting out. And even though he says, say now to Hezekiah, he's calling them out. And so he shouts out, say now to Hezekiah, calling him out, says, thus says the great king. And he noticed that he didn't call Hezekiah. He didn't say now to your king Hezekiah. No, he just says, say to Hezekiah. And that in itself was an insult. It was meant to be an insult. It was something that was part of his all over plan to denigrate King Hezekiah in the sight and in the minds of his own people. So the point of his first speech here is that there is no salvation in faith. You can have all the faith you want to, but there's no salvation. There's no deliverance coming from that would come from trusting Adonai, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Judah should surrender now, because Egypt would not be able to help her. God would not be able to help her, and she didn't have enough military manpower to win. And so Assyria had authority, his last point is Assyria had authority from God to attack Jerusalem. We'll see this in later verses. So the Rabshakeh told the Judean officials to give Hezekiah, it didn't even call him by name, and a message from the great king. And that's what the Assyrian monarchs called themselves. And so he questioned Hezekiah's confidence that would have led him to rebel against Sennacherib. And so clearly Sennacherib wanted the Judahites to know that he regarded Hezekiah as just a minor chieftain of his empire, incapable of resisting any kind of massive power of the Assyrian Empire. So He was he did not regard Hezekiah very highly. So verse 5, I say your strategy and strength for war are only words of a lip. Who do you rely on now, so that you have rebelled against me? So the commander claimed this commander here, guy, he claimed that Hezekiah's strategy lacked wisdom and arms, that it was only amounted to blustering, empty words. And it's kind of ironic that just a short time later from this, it would be empty words or rumors that would defeat him, the Rabshakeh, and of course Sennacherib, and we'll see that later on. So he's just saying that your words and your strategies and everything are not gonna do anything, and that you will be defeated. And it's like, who are you going to rely on now? Egypt is defeated. So going on to verse 6, behold, you rely on this splintered reed as a staff, Egypt. If a man leans on it, it will go into the palm of his hand and pierce it. Thus Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is to all. Thus Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is to all who trust him. In other words, you try to trust in Egypt, they're going to be like a kind of a sharpened stick, and you lean on that, it's gonna bite you. It's going to put a hole in your hand, and it's not going to help you. And so that's what he's trying to portray here. He's driving home this fact that reliance on Egypt is going to fail. Same thing that Isaiah had been telling them all along. Well, now the enemy Sennacherib, through the Rabshakeh, is telling them the very same thing. And so at this point in history, the Egyptian army had already been defeated, like I showed you on the map, at El Teka. And so they were no longer a threat to anybody. And so this fact and this guy pointing it out would have been all too painfully obvious to the residents of Jerusalem. Anybody got any comments or questions so far?
Yeah. Rabbi,
Yes, ma'am.
was Hezekiah supposed to be coming under a directive of God or Adonai at this time, and yet he was relying on Egypt to rescue him?
Previously, he had been up until this point. Yes, he had tried to make treaties with Egypt, as his father had, and tried to enlist other armies and other allies to help him fight against Assyria. But that's quickly coming to an end here with Hezekiah, and then he would eventually rely on the Lord, ask for the Lord to give him victory here. And so yeah, we will see that. But yeah, he had trusted in human armies rather than the Lord up until this point, and it was just about to bite him in the tuchus.
Okay, but so Hezekiah didn't have previous instructions from God as to what to do, and Hezekiah disregarded it. He didn't have any instructions like that. He just went straight to the Egyptian Pharaoh. And
really, in fact, he had quite a few messages from Isaiah telling him just exactly that. Do not go to Egypt, and don't try to make a treaty with them. And by the time Isaiah is telling them this, well, Hezekiah had already sent an envoy down to Egypt to try to get their support. And so there were quite a few. I mean, we went through several chapters of Isaiah showing and telling the leaders of Judah how foolish it was and how fruitless it would be for them to rely on human armies, on the arm of flesh, as it were, rather than just repenting, asking God to take care of them, and just stand back and pop the popcorn and watch it. And so that was he had plenty opportunities to obey the Lord, and he just hadn't done it up to this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. All right. Anything else anybody has? Okay, so if you say to me, we trust in Adonai our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, and then said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar? All right, so what is this guy doing? All right, he mistakenly, he knew about Hezekiah's religious reforms. Remember, Hezekiah had gone through there, and he tore down a lot of the altars and the high places and so forth where they worshiped the false gods. And so in this guy's mind, Hezekiah had removed these altars, and for him, it must be that the God of Judah, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Adonai, he would, by removing these altars and things, well, that was just going to make God mad. And so he didn't understand that these high places and these altars were the antithesis of what God wanted, that he did not want them up there. He wanted them to worship in Jerusalem. And so here he is. He's kind of making a mistake here. He did not do his due diligence and get all of his opposition reports lined out to where he understood the religion of Judah. And so here's what he's saying, that he just thought that, well, you taking down all of these altars and everything, your God must be really mad at you now, and this is the God that you're going to ask for favor and for help after you've destroyed his worship places. There again is a false premise that Hezekiah had made God mad what in reality he was just carrying out God's wishes. So anyway, this guy, he kind of blew it on this. He didn't have everything lined out properly for his argument. So he goes on, verse 8. So now make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you could put riders on them. So he's kind of taunting them. Okay. Judah was so inferior in, militarily, that this guy thought, shoot, I can give them 2,000 horses for a cavalry, and they wouldn't have enough cavalry soldiers or people that even knew how to fight from a horse. So it would have been, he says, I can give you 2,000 of them, and I can still beat you. And it'd be kind of like what Rush Limbaugh said, that he had half his brain tied behind his back just to make it fair. And so I'd put down there, he's tying one hand behind your back going into a fight just to make it fair. And be like going into a race and giving your rival a real long lead, and then you catch up to him. And so that's what this Rabshakeh had in mind in taunting Judah, is that I'll give you 2,000 horses, and it would still whip your armies, your cavalry, and your infantry, and so forth. So anyway, that was what he was saying in that verse. Verse 9. So how can you repulse a single lieutenant, the least of my master's servants? Yes, you're relying on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen. So again, the Judeans didn't have enough strength to repulse even a minor Assyrian officer or enough soldiers to man the horses and chariots that they were looking to Egypt, to supply them. So it's like giving weapons to someone who is too weak or too unfamiliar with everything to fight. And I just got a thing here. It says that I just got 99 messages, and I don't know. I think somebody was sitting on their plus button there, and yeah, I don't see that there's anything. All right, I was just looking. Yeah, somewhere along the line. Okay, just checking up on that because my screen flashed and said you had text message or chat message, so we didn't. All right. So yeah, they said a lieutenant, the least of Sennacherib's his servants. And so I thought, well, they must have that term, the least of his servants. It should have been maybe the least of his officers, because the a second lieutenant, which is equivalent in naval services of an ensign, they're not really highly regarded in the military ranks as knowing anything, and so pretty much being incompetent because they have no experience. Well, and so the Rabshakeh is just saying, yeah, we could send up a second lieutenant or an ensign up against you guys, and you wouldn't be able to defeat him. So that was an insult that I think kind of had to be military to understand that one. So and again, he taunts them about their reliance on Egypt and how foolish that was. Verse 10, moreover, now have I now come up against this land to destroy it with Adonai's approval? Adonai said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. So perhaps this guy was referring to chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, where in Isaiah's prophecy, God would send Assyria against his people as a judgment. And so otherwise, he may also have been claiming divine authorization for Sennacherib's invasion when there really wasn't any. He was lying. It was and it was not unusual for, in the ancient Near East, the conquerors to claim that the God of the invaded people had joined the invaders, So let me check. Yeah, Martha says these were just intimidation tactics, like Satan likes to do to us. Sure is. And it's what in the military we would call psychological operations, psyops, psychological warfare. And so going to verse 11, then Eliakim and Shebna and Joah said to Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Don't speak to us in the language of the Jews when the people on the wall are listening. So Hezekiah's guys down there, they interrupted the Rabshakeh, and when they heard that last little statement of his, and because they wanted to kind of quiet things down. Aramaic was the common language of diplomacy during those days. politicians normally conducted their diplomatic talks in that language. It didn't become the common language of Canaan until many years later. By the time Yeshua came along, another 700 years later, 500, 600 years, 700 years later, it was the common language at that point. But that's what Yeshua spoke in the home would have been Aramaic. That was the common language of the day. So the Rabshakeh then, he spoke to the king's officials in the common Hebrew that all of the people of Jerusalem understood. So he probably did this so that all the people, not just the king's officials, would understand his message and take it as an insult to the king's officials. So by using Hebrew, then the Rabshakeh was also implying that that they did not know Aramaic, that they were just backwater ignoramuses. They were, again, a double insult kind of a thing. And so his whole thing was to undermine the people's confidence in their leadership. But the Rabshakeh said, "Has my master sent me only to your master and to you to speak these words? Hasn't he sent me to the men who sit on the wall, who eat your own waste and drink your own urine with you?" All right, so that's really nasty here. He's basically saying, I'm sending this message is for everybody out there in the city, and it's going to be for all of you people that are going to be reduced to starvation and no water when we get through with you. And he did it in very graphic terms. So again, his whole idea, his whole thrust here was to destroy the people's confidence and to tell them what the horrible conditions are going to be when we set up our siege warfare, and then we're going to show no mercy, and you're going to run out of food, and you're going to run out of water, and it's going to be just horrible as it can be. So then it goes on. I put all of these together, these verses here together. Then the Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice, even louder than he was before, shouting in Hebrew, and said, "Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, don't let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Nor let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in Adonai by saying, Adonai will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Don't listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make peace with me and come out to me, then everyone will eat from his own vine and fig tree, and everyone will drink water from his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards." All right, so what the Rabshakeh is saying here, he resumed his speech, his prepared talking points, and he addressed all of the people out there in Jerusalem that they could hear him, and so he was telling them that he asked them to not listen to Hezekiah, that they should listen to Sennacherib. Hezekiah would not deliver them. He said that they should not be trusting in God's word, that he would protect them. So evidently the Assyrians knew that Isaiah's policy of trusting the Lord was a popular one with many of the Jerusalemites, but what could they do? They weren't in charge. So the Rabshakeh promised that if the city would surrender, the people would enjoy peace and prosperity rather than war and starvation. They would still be deported because that was the well-known Assyrian policy. That's what happened when people were conquered. They were exiled and sent away. But he portrayed that the land that they were going to would be very similar to where they already were, and that they would have provisions. They wouldn't starve to death. So anyway, that was his speech. And going on to verse 18, beware that Hezekiah does not mislead you by saying, Adonai will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nation delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Indeed, when did they deliver Samaria from my hand? So, all right, this guy's he gets into it even more here. He made a fatal mistake, though. He compared Israel's God to the little g gods, I call them, the little g gods of the nations, specifically Aram, which is Syria. But he even talked about Samaria. He said, Samaria had fallen 21 years earlier, and Samaria had the same God that you guys got down here in Jerusalem. He didn't protect the Samaritans, Sumerians. He's not gonna protect you either. And we know that God had turned over the northern kingdoms to Assyria because of her idolatry. But the Rabshakeh, he viewed that surrender and defeat of Samaria as it's just plain fact that the God of Samaria, even though it may be the same God of Judah, was not strong enough to protect them from the hand of the Assyrians. And so that was his mindset, his philosophy on that. So said, who among the gods of these lands have delivered their country out of my hand? So will Adonai deliver Jerusalem from my hand? Again, he's just harping on that thing, that all the people that wherever they were in any of the lands that they had already gone through, none of the gods of those nations. And remember, all of the people, in those days, each nation or each region had its own set of deities, and they had their own idols and their own way of worshiping these things. And so when a nation came in and conquered another nation, then, just everybody knows it was because the conquered nation, their God was not as strong as the conquering nation, the one that defeated them. And so here again, this is what he's saying, and he's asking them. He says, so, okay, how is your God any different than all of these other ones? None of the other ones were able to stop us. Even up there in Samaria, it was the same God, your God, and he couldn't stop us then, and he can't stop us now. We're going to take over Jerusalem. It's just a matter of getting the whole army up here. He only came up there with a couple of thousand people, but he said, we can bring the whole army up here, and then it will be, all over but the shouting. So, last couple of verses. But they were silent and did not answer him a word, for the king's commandment was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna the scribe, and Joash, son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, told him the words of Rabshakeh. And now, all right, so what we're seeing here is these guys showed up. They didn't try to offer any kind of a rebuttal at all, because their instructions were find out what he wants, listen to what he says, and then turn around and come back. We're not going to have a discussion out there, on the viaduct, our aqueduct, in front of everybody. And so they came with torn clothes. He said they had torn clothing, and that would have been just because of the sign, the way that the people showed their grief, or their grief, I guess would be a good word, or their distress, when they would rip some of their clothes, because clothing was hard to come by back in those days. It's not like people nowadays where you got 100 shirts and 50 pairs of pants and 25 pairs of shoes and so forth. Back in those days, you might have 2 changes of clothes and only 1 pair of shoes or sandals. And so tearing your clothes was kind of a sign of grief, and that's what they did. And they so what was Israel going to? How are they going to respond? What were they going to do? Well, they're still going to be muddled for a while, but God did not leave them without defenses, and so it was just a wait and see. Now, next week we're going to see what Hezekiah's view toward that would be, and what his instructions would be. And fortunately, he turned to the Lord, and they had a brief respite. So anyway, that is the